Okay, I think we're all set with recording if you want to get started.
Awesome.
Sweet. All right. Welcome to the IPFS Community Working Group call. Sweet, sweet, sweet. All right. So we'll start with just a quick check-in with everybody here. I'll start out. Back this week, which is nice after taking a week off. Jump back into a bunch of different stuff. The big one is some metrics work that is really actually interesting to, I think, the whole community working group. So I'll give some more details on that and actually go through some of the data that we've collected later after the updates finish. Tara, you want to go next?
Sure. So my big thing this week has been launching Proto School. So before that went out, I did some pair programming with Ollie, which was great to get the mobile nav working, made a couple of last minute tweaks to get things as good as we could before that. Monday, I gave the presentation on our IPFS weekly call. We had time for a little bit of Q&A there. So in the notes from this call, I've included the links to a condensed video that Zach helped me make that's kind of just my presentation plus a piece that I missed and popped in at the end, I'll put together. That's already had 193 views on YouTube, which is awesome. There's also a link there to the slide deck from that call. Feel free to share that presentation with anyone. And then there's also a link to the full recording of the weekly call that has the Q&A plus some tangents that are unrelated. And we've had a lot of requests for chapter setup since that Monday call. We've had requests from Hong Kong, Mumbai, Phoenix, Beijing, Berlin, Seattle, and DC. And those Beijing and Phoenix are 2 requests each from different people. So working through trying to help people get set up with that. And then I'm also adding licenses to the various Proto School repos, which I had missed earlier. So that's been added to the main one. And now I need to go back and do it on organizing in the various chapter repos. And then I'm just now kind of working on getting a slightly more template-y version of what I give people when they get a chapter at the beginning when we set up the repo, just so it has a little bit more structure, has the license built in. That kind of thing. And then upcoming for me includes, I need to figure out how to locate and invite IPFS meetup organizers to see if they'd like to lead chapters. I think some of the people who have reached out already are those folks, some not. And then I need to do some exploration myself, kind of find the resources that exist right now to teach myself the IPFS file API in preparation for building out a new Proto School tutorial that covers that. So that's probably what's next on my docket.
Hey, I've been working on the community sync. I have pair programmed with Andre in working with the Google API and also like building a command line interface for putting in a PR. I was able to actually get our notes from the different meetings and turn it into Markdown, but that's still a work in progress. Another work in progress, which is closer to being finished, is actually making a feature where you can announce your meetings during as a GitHub issue. So I've worked with Michael with that. It still needs some more work, but it's definitely coming along. So, and I also put in a proposal for Waffle.js to speak about like IPFS and how people can get started to contributing to IPFS. So I hope that talk is accepted. Next on the list is to continue with the community sync tool. And I'm not sure if I have other stuff I will talk to Michael about in terms of Filecoin. So that's me.
Cool. Dan, do you have any updates that you want to share? Or just on to observe today?
Sure, yeah. So I think one thing that I posted an issue about that I'd really like to see now that we do have some chapters coming on board is potentially a Proto School dedicated chat room somewhere I know that IPFS and Protocol Labs in general has a set of Riot channels, matrix channels, and I'm wondering maybe we should have our own.
Yeah, I have a tab open to reply to that.
Perfect.
Yeah. I'll detail it in the issue for kind of everyone's benefit who's not like watching the call. But yeah, I mean, we should consider it, but there's also a lot to kind of take away from what Node School did, which was like they kind of forced everything people into GitHub when they had issues, which then connected them with this sort of support structure and open source that they could, have for the rest of their programming, including like when they sort of left just the learning phase, which I always found kind of interesting. But yeah, there might be some differences, so we can talk about it and consider it. Cool.
Okay. Yeah, so we'll do it an issue.
Awesome. Jim?
Not a whole lot on my end. I did work through all the modules on Proto School and tried them out myself, so I passed. Yay! And
Woo! Congratulations!
I did a pull request that changed one.
Yes, so, Jim added a C to a word that was missing a C. It was very helpful. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Okay.
And Kevin just joined us. Kevin, am I remembering correctly that you're one of our new chapter organizers? You might be on mute if you're talking to us.
Kevin?
I don't think you might not want to talk to us.
Oh, well. No worries.
That's okay. Welcome, Kevin.
Type in chat.
Silent Kevin.
Cool. So we did some OKR updates, so I'd just like to
there's
check
Kevin.
in. Oh, there's Kevin. Hey,
hi. Welcome.
Hi.
So yeah, let's check in on just like the OKR status real quick. I'll share my screen real fast just so that everybody can see. Well, we updated with priorities, so now we have these nice badges everywhere from Ollie. Thank you, Ollie. And just want to check in. So Terry, why don't you tell us sort of where we're at in terms of getting Proto School out into its own top level project in the future?
Well, as you see the way the OKRs are structured here, each of these key results on the left is a link. So there is a link to roadmap planning, but that has not officially started yet. So we're at about a 0 out of whatever our scale goes up to on completion of that one. In terms of metrics, that one has not been started, but we have sort of the plan in place is to use Google event tracking for that. And I want to also make sure that the sort of standard Google Analytics is working with you to give us everything we need. So Michael suggested a package manager that I can look at for that one. And then the file. So yeah, Michael, you completed, I think, the segment of this, making the site capable of doing the file uploads, and the next piece in that is me working on the lesson itself.
Cool. Portion of question?
For the IPFS ready event, Michael and I will pair program on that. So for now, that's at a 0, but I'm not sure if we're going to start on that soon.
Yeah, we'll probably push it. I mean, it's a P2, so we'll probably do it a little bit later in the quarter, just because we have a bunch of other stuff I think to knock through first. So.
Okay, and then there's the community working group taxonomy of resources, Stack Overflow, docs, microsites that people can find when developing on IPFS. Haven't started on that yet, but I think that's something that will also occur like later in this quarter.
Mm-hmm. Also, to jump back up, there's the first contributor guidelines are separated from the regular contribution policy, that stuff as well.
Oh my gosh, I've missed like a whole bunch. Okay.
No I scrolled at one point.
There's random scrolling happening without.
My bad.
It's not your fault.
Yeah.
The first time contributors are greeted by inviting an automated message. Haven't started on that yet. But I am starting on like the automation in general. I don't think that should be too taxing, but that will probably come before some of the other goals.
Cool. Okay, cool. looking good, looking good. Okay, so while I'm still doing my screen share, why don't I pull up some of the data that I pulled? So I have a repository at github/protocol/github. No, wait, is that it? No, okay, here, I'll find it in a second. Nope, it's not on Protoschool. On Protocol Labs. So for IPFS, we're collecting a bunch of metrics from our GitHub org, essentially. But the tool itself can actually pull data out of any GitHub org. So like all of the other top-level projects that have their own org will be able to use the same tool, as well as anybody in the community. That's why it's open source. So right now, using the GitHub Migrations API, this is able to pull out tarballs for all of the metadata about all the activity that's ever happened in the entire org. And then we can generate some metric CSVs. And so I've taken those CSVs and created some nice charts here in Google Sheets. I'll share this link with everybody so that you can pull it up. It's already live. Where did the chat go? I don't know how to do the chat. Here, I will put it in this Google Doc. And then there we go. Pull up the Google Doc that's already in the chat.
Lastly on the call too.
Yeah. Yeah, apparently when you're sharing, you don't have access to chat easily. Okay, so anyway, so we have some graphs here that just show some basic data. Like this is the number of unique users that we've seen in the org over time. And that's unique users every quarter, actually. The reason to break it down by quarter is that there are various, so in open source generally, like if you're just looking at sort of like the top level data, there are these huge variances in activity between weekdays and weekends. And when on average, you're only having like maybe a 2 to 5% change in activity every month, if you have more or less weekends in a month, it greatly impacts that. And so it's not actually a change in the activity of the project. It's just like a variance in how many weekdays versus weekends. If you break things down by quarter, it normalizes a lot of that. And what you end up having is like you have a fairly light Q4 usually because a lot of people kind of take off in December. And you usually have a really strong Q1 because everybody comes back in January. And January and February are some of the biggest months in sort of all GitHub activity generally. Anyway, so yeah, so we have sort of total unique users. This is the total number of actions, just activity broken down by type across the entire org. So you can see that, our issues, grew and grew and then declined a ton and then came back in the org. But issue comments are relatively flat, which is like an interesting thing that's happened. And you can see that like pull requests have actually gone up like tremendously and, just since 2017. So that's really cool to see. Yeah, there's also, the same kind of data, but this is the number of unique users that engaged in that action. So rather than the activity, just the number of people that we find engaging. And you can see that while it's kind of flat, we saw a big increase coming into 2018 for issues and for a bunch of other stuff. And then the issue stuff really kind of leveled off in terms of unique new people coming. But the overall sort of activity for pull requests and stuff like that actually came up quite a bit during that time. And then, yeah, you always see this little slump into Q4. That's totally normal. It's not anything to worry about. Then these numbers are really noisy, and there's a thread about sort of fixing this. But like, this is the growth percentage for each of these, both in total actions and in unique people. So looking at the growth as a percentage growth rate quarter over quarter is an interesting way to look at this. But I have an issue here that I would love people's feedback on. It's issue 1 in this repository. I'll post a link to it in the notes, but basically there are lots of other questions that we can ask this data. We have literally all of the activity data for the entire org. So what I really want to know from everybody here and really in the whole project is like, what are new questions that we want to ask this data? What are new insights that we'd like to have into the project in terms of how we're doing and what kinds of metrics that we're collecting? So please comment on this, and yeah, I will put this in the notes right now. Cool. And yeah, that's about it. Any sort of questions just like about this data generally? Yeah, Jim.
Well, first thing when I'm seeing these graphs that pops in my mind is I would like to see like if you could sort of do PL contributors versus other identifiable groups and see like, is there real organic, because I mean, like, we're being paid to work on this, so obviously if there's 400 contributors and the head and it's grown 100 people and we've hired 100 people in the past year, that explains most of that
So
those new contributors. So
we have not hired 100 engineers across all projects, much less IPFS. So we definitely brought in some new people. I think that, like, though, when you look at pull requests, right, unique users by pull request, we see like an increase of about, like, in 2018 from the beginning of the year to the end is something like, that looks like about 60 or 70. Like that's quite a bit. Like we did not hire that many people to work on IPFS. We didn't even hire 70 new people at PL. I totally agree that I would like to separate out the PL people from this. It's just a lot harder than you would think. Like very few people at PL actually put Protocol Labs like in their GitHub profile information. So if it were there, I would be able to pluck them out pretty easily. But also we hire people from the community sometimes, and sometimes people like we actually expect that occasionally people will leave PL and then work somewhere else where they still contribute. And so like, how do you separate that activity? Because it's actually like during one time period they were working for PL, and during another they actually weren't. So if we really want to drill into it, it's actually kind of difficult. I think that what would be probably easier is to quantify the number of unique people that we've put on a project and just at different time periods, and then subtract that from the total.
I think
assuming that everybody that we hired did something related to their job in that quarter, right?
Yeah, you could do like more sophisticated. I mean, this is all like much more work, but sort people into buckets, and then you have a state machine which links, people transition from this to they start,
right,
these are community contributors, and then you can, like, if you can sort of like hash all the GitHub usernames into particular buckets, but then realize that people change buckets over time, so then it gets sort of complicated. But then you can sort of like monitor little flows between the different ones. But it's a much more complicated modeling task. So
it is, but also, like, I think I want us to ask a few more questions of the data, because we may move away from this particular data set. Like this may not be as interesting to us as, say, like, one thing that I'm not doing yet is just cataloging the number of brand new people each quarter. So like we've never seen them engage in this kind of activity, or we've never seen them period until this point in time. Because right now it's just unique per quarter. It doesn't really tell us if they're new to the project, like absolutely. And once we start tracking that data, that may actually be more interesting. And it's very easy to quantify how many people that we add in every quarter. Like we know that pretty easily. So that would be very simple. And then you only need to knock it off of that quarter, because once you see them once, they're never counted again.
Growth analysis is always about the churn too. It's like how many people are leaving. So you had a contributor for 2 years and then they disappeared. And then how many people are doing that?
Yeah. There's another thing that I'd like. There's other data that isn't useful for, it doesn't really graph well, but it's useful to understand, which is like, for people that send a pull request, what other activities do they engage in and on what timeline, right? So before we see an initial pull request, we see just issue comments. And do we see them first, like, do people show up a year before they send a pull request, or do they literally show up, like, on average a month before? So like information like that is really interesting to look at as well. But yeah, it's just not something that we would put on a graph. It's just like a single number that would be sort of interesting to track.
And I would also say, like, if you start getting into that level of detail, like the numbers aren't that large, but you'd pair some quantitative analysis with some qualitative analysis, like actually pick some people out of at random, and then actually go out and look at what they did, but then also just like maybe contact them in person and interview them.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So when I started looking at the meetups that have been happening around the world, I literally just reached out to every meetup organizer, because there weren't that many, and then just sort of talked to them about, like, hey, like, what are you struggling with? Like, is it going normally? And one of the reasons why we sort of focused on Proto School was, like, a lot of them felt like there weren't enough people that knew IPFS, and they didn't really have like a lot of great materials to teach them. So That's kind of where proto school came from a little bit. Okay, cool. If we can turn these into sort of succinct questions into that issue, that would be awesome. Because I would definitely like to get these in. And by the way, we're already pulling out some data in like a metrics.json that is literally just single numbers. They're not CSVs that are meant to be turned into line graphs like this. So we can literally ask any question. Cool. Any other questions before I move on?
Yeah, I might have one.
Cool.
And so we're talking about trying to bring people on board with these tutorials. And I think it'd be really interesting to see where we're having people having the most issues, obviously, like so tracking which tutorials might be hardest, but also is there a turnover? So at some point, do people start going from just like having issues to maybe contributing? So is there a particular set of tutorials that actually onboard people to working on something more than just continuing the tutorial set?
So the first part of your question will be addressed when I add event tracking. So hopefully we'll be able to track things like whether you submitted the correct answer, those kinds of things, to help us figure out which lessons are the hardest. I think I could easily identify right now which lesson will have the most incorrect answers. But the second piece, in terms of figuring out what people do afterwards, I know less about Google Analytics probably than Michael does. So there is an issue open right now, which Michael opened after some Twitter discussion, that we could potentially add sort of a next steps screen that appears at the end of each of our lessons that could have some links out to different things like other resources for learning that concept, or places you could apply it, or places you can contribute to. So that's going to be both, both there's the project in there of how do we physically set that up, like creating the template for that, but also then recruiting like what are the projects we want people to work on. So there's going to be some work in alignment there. And I'm not sure, like I think we would be able to track what was clicked on in that list, whether we can track all the way through from they clicked there to they actually contributed to a project, I presume is much more challenging. What's your gut reaction, Michael?
Yeah, so we should be able either already or very shortly in Google Analytics to figure out like where people fall off. Like if they start out and then they don't finish a lesson, or if they do finish a lesson but it was particularly hard, like those kinds of questions we should be able to answer in a really self-contained way. We don't have a way right now to connect a user profile in Google Analytics though to like a GitHub profile. We've talked about how, so right now, the way that we save like your lesson state and all of that stuff is just in local storage. So if you pull up a new browser, it just like won't be there. And that's not always ideal for everybody. So when we have like, we want to add some features that would require some kind of login for persistence. This is a really good argument to make that login be login with GitHub, because then we would be able to associate that Google Analytics profile with that particular GitHub user. And then we would be able to see like, oh, okay, here are like the GitHub profiles that completed particular tutorials. We would be able to look at, do they have new repositories that depend on IPFS? Are they engaged in the IPFS project in other places? Like we'd actually be able to connect those dots at that point. But that's, at least another quarter out probably, because we don't plan on adding that feature until the second quarter. Yeah, does that answer your question, Dan?
I think so. Yeah, that'd be really cool to see. I don't know if that'd be even something we could throw in, like an issue for later, and like one of the OKRs potentially to think about.
Yeah. We should create an issue. So we have an issue right now tracking the additional metrics just in Google Analytics. So the first part stuff that was just contained in Google Analytics, that I think is already captured there, which is great, and we are working on that. The second part where we want to associate a GitHub profile and we want to add some features that would persist over time based on your sort of your logged in account. I don't know if we have an issue for that yet. Do we have an issue for that, Terry? I know that we talked about it like, back in Q4 that like maybe we
no, I mean the last I heard it was not in the at all.
Okay.
That we were just going to continue doing it as the browser that you're in is the one that knows what you've done.
Right, right. Okay, so let's add an issue for that feature, and then just note in the feature that like we also want to set a flag once they log in that connects their analytics user session to their GitHub profile, and then that would connect the dots. So once that's there, we can pull out all the rest of the data. Cool. Any other questions before we move on?
This would be optional, Michael?
Yeah. It would be optional. We would continue on with the local storage stuff if they weren't doing this syncing. Yeah.
Okay.
Or potentially we would actually pull in something like like maybe actually PouchDB or some other sort of like on top of local storage or IDB solution that syncs well between different browsers. And we would plug that in. Or potentially we could just store all of this state data in IPFS if we can properly connect their account back. But then we'd have to encrypt it. Okay. No. We can talk about that in the issue.
Let's talk about that in a new issue. Okay.
Yeah, okay. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. And yeah, so I think our last little chunk here is for some any additional items or Q&As or whatnot.
I have just one little pitch. I put together a very light chapter template that kind of mimics the design of the main web page. And so I think I threw an issue. It's a separate repo. I could throw that repo into our org for people to look at if that's something of value. Otherwise, I can just use it for Denver.
Let me. No, I saw you post that, Dan. I'm sorry, and then I lost track of the thread, so I haven't looked at your template yet. But I think it's a great idea to have that as an option for people. Like what I envision, like going back to what Michael said earlier about the reason we were envisioning using GitHub as the place for discussion, is that we could have sort of we could have organizers sharing with each other templates and things like that. And some of them we might want to host within the organizing site, or it could just be people saying, hey, go look at how I did this thing for Mumbai. I think it's really cool. You can copy it if you want to, or they could be some things that are more formatted with fill in the blanks instead of already having Denver filled in. What were you about to say, Michael?
I was just saying, like, our onboarding for new chapters is starting to include like quite a few kind of manual steps, and so at some point we're going to want to probably automate that. And if we have this like great template for getting the site up, that could be like a checkbox when they ask for a new chapter, like, hey, yeah, like add this template, and then the automation would pull that data in as well.
Well, I think that's different than the other things that we're doing though. Like the things that we definitely need are stuff like there's a license. They have a code of conduct, which right now we're letting people craft their own code of conduct and giving them some suggestions as to resources they could use. Like there are things that I am ensuring are done before I allow the site to be listed on our chapter listings on our website. Mm-hmm. And having a website, like having a GitHub Pages site, is not one of them. And I do not expect that every chapter will want to do that. So I think there are places where they'll want to just use an IPFS meetup or whatever. So we have not made having a GitHub Pages website a requirement. And therefore I wouldn't envision a website template, which is I think what Dan has created as a thing that's essential. I would envision it as a like, hey, if you want to build a website, here's how you can get it added to the website. Here's a template you can use if you're interested.
So maybe at a higher level, actually, it would be good to have a repo that you could fork that's just a templated chapter.
So that could work. One thing, so this goes back to when I started it was actually the IOJS internationalization community, like localization community, but now it's the Node.js localization community. But basically, it was this sort of all call, like, hey, like, if you want to set up a localization community for a particular language, tell me and we'll get it set up. And so very similar to Node School, like, they get a repo, they get added to it. One of the things that I noticed was that like their engagement with the repo, like they didn't feel like they had the right to really like administrate it, even though they were added as admins to it, until you sort of gave them a task to do themselves that required admin. So what I started doing was like every time that I would set up a repo, I would I had an issue template, and that would be the first issue. And it was just a bunch of things that they could go do, like, you know, add a README to it that had these things. So if we have some documentation for like, hey, here's a template for a website. Here's some documentation on how DH Pages works if you want to build something else. You could also just link to your meetup. Like if we just document that and put it in an issue and then add it, it would give all new organizers like some steps to take on themselves and then actually feel like they own the repo a little bit more.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it's hard to make people actually feel enabled to like make decisions and do things even after you give them access. So this could be like one of those nice things. And it's not something like the license that we're like actually kind of worried about a little bit, like in the code of conduct where it's like, you really need to have these, like, let's just add them when we onboard them. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, if you want to take a look, Michael, at the Seattle and DC chapters, which I haven't even told those organizers that they're there yet. Those ones are me just today putting in a fully complete license and a placeholder code of conduct and some placeholder text in the body of the repo that includes some like to do, actually write something here. So take a look at that and see if you think there are any of those pieces that would make more sense as issues, because I do kind of like the idea of like, oh, I should be using the issue queue. So we could put some of those things there or leave it, I don't know, whatever's easiest for people to get going with.
Another thing too is that in the issue template that we have for them requesting a new chapter, we should probably in that try to capture the code of conduct contact. So that by the time that we add the repo, we can just create the code of conduct and put in the contact that they gave us when they applied for the chapter, if that makes sense.
So do you want every chapter using identical codes of conduct? Because that's not what we've said now. We've said an option is to use the contributor code of conduct.
I think that we should, so that COC and the link to it exists in their repo that they have admin to, so they can modify it. And move to a different one if they choose. But I think that we should start them out with one, along with a contact. And the reason that I like the ones that we've gone with, the conf code of conduct for in-person and the contributor covenant for code, they have a lot of translations as well. So one thing that a lot of these places may do is actually just like pull out the link that we have to the default page and put like the specific link to their localization, stuff like that.
Yeah, I can see where a lot of these proto schools might be like part of another event, like an IPFS meetup. So they want to keep the same code of conduct rather than have two separate ones.
Yeah, that's happened already, actually. So the Porto chapter is organized by the OPO network folks who happen to be, I think, the Moxie folks who we know. So they are linking to their OPO code of conduct as the code of conduct for their chapter. So in their case, they would have had to like delete out the file that we had, et cetera, if we did that. But for some people, it might have been easier. I don't know, Kevin, what you would have preferred. Feel free to, I know your mic's not working, but you can chat if you have a preference on this concept. Kevin just set up our, I think it's Hong Kong, right? Is it Hong Kong that you did, Kevin? Yes.
Yeah, cool.
So.
I mean, just having them deleted is fine. Like, I think that, starting out with something to set the expectation that like you need to have something is good. And then, if they pull it out for theirs, because like especially like the OPO network thing is a really good example where they don't want to maintain like the points of contact changes in like multiple different locations. Like if they bring on a new organizer and they're tackling this now, they just want to update it in one place. And so it's much better to just be like, okay. So we're a little bit over time, but anything else that anybody has real quick? Or okay, sweet. All right. Thank you all for coming. See you next week. This has been the Community Working Group Call. Awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.